The gorge was 200 meters across, and Bernard Fergusson had maybe 8 hours before Japanese patrols would discover his column trapped on the wrong side with 47 wounded men who couldn't march and couldn't be left behind. He stood at the cliff edge, watching moonlight illuminate the chasm that separated his Chindit force from safety, calculating whether rope bridge construction was physically possible in darkness, with exhausted men using equipment that was designed for climbing, not for spanning distances this extreme. The alternative was abandoning the wounded, or fighting through Japanese positions with casualties that would destroy his column's combat effectiveness. And neither alternative was acceptable, which meant the bridge had to work despite seeming impossible when he examined the engineering challenges involved. The Chindits had been operating behind Japanese lines for 6 weeks, disrupting supply lines and gathering intelligence in Burma's jungle terrain that conventional forces couldn't penetrate. The operations had been successful beyond expectations, but success had come with casualties that accumulated faster than evacuation procedures could handle. Fergusson's column had 23 men with serious wounds that required immediate medical attention. They couldn't receive in jungle conditions. Another 24 with injuries that made extended marching impossible, but who might survive if they could reach Allied positions across the gorge. The wounded were slowing the column's movement and making them vulnerable to Japanese pursuit that was systematically sweeping the area looking for exactly these kinds of isolated British units. The gorge had appeared on maps as minor terrain feature that reconnaissance suggested could be crossed through shallow ravine 2 kilometers south. But when Fergusson reached the supposed crossing point, he discovered the ravine was actually vertical cliff face that no column with wounded could traverse. The maps were wrong, or outdated, or had been deliberately falsified by Japanese intelligence to channel British movements into killing zones. Regardless of why the maps were incorrect, Fergusson faced immediate tactical problem with no standard solution. His column was trapped between Japanese pursuit and geographic obstacle that appeared impassable. The bridge idea came from his climbing officer, a lieutenant who had mountaineered in Scotland before the war and who carried rope and carabiners as personal equipment, despite those items not being standard Chindit kit. The lieutenant suggested that rope bridge spanning the gorge was theoretically possible if they could anchor cables on both sides, and if they had sufficient rope, and if the structure could support men crossing one at a time, with wounded being carried. The proposal had multiple points of failure and required expertise that nobody in the column possessed at professional level, but it was only suggestion anyone had offered that didn't involve abandoning wounded or fighting through superior Japanese forces. Fergusson ordered immediate reconnaissance of both cliff faces, looking for anchor points that could support bridge cables under load. The reconnaissance teams reported finding rock formations on the near side that seemed adequate, but couldn't assess the far side without actually crossing the gorge. The far side anchors would have to be located by the first person who crossed carrying rope, would have to be sufficient to support full bridge load without any ability to test them before committing the entire column to crossing. The uncertainty was operationally intolerable, but time pressure made perfect information impossible, and Fergusson had to make decisions based on incomplete knowledge and calculated risk. The rope inventory was barely sufficient for the attempt. Chindit columns carried climbing rope for descending steep terrain and for stream crossings, but not for bridge construction spanning distances this extreme. Fergusson ordered every piece of rope collected from across the column, ordered parachute cord salvaged from supply drops, ordered equipment straps and pack ties gathered as supplementary materials that could extend the rope supply. The assembled materials totaled approximately 400 meters of varying quality and thickness, maybe enough for bridge construction if nothing broke, and if the engineering worked perfectly on first attempt. The crossing technique required someone to traverse the gorge first carrying rope that would become the bridge's foundation cable. The traversal would use rope stretched across the chasm at maximum tension, with the crosser suspended below the rope and pulling themselves hand over hand while additional rope paid out behind them. The technique was standard climbing procedure for crossing gaps, but standard procedure assumed gaps of maybe 30 meters, not 200, assumed daylight conditions, not darkness, assumed fresh climbers, not exhausted soldiers who had been marching through jungle for 6 weeks. The scaling of technique from training exercise to operational necessity introduced failure modes that nobody could predict accurately. The lieutenant volunteered to make the first crossing, and Fergusson accepted because nobody else had relevant climbing experience and because time pressure eliminated opportunity to train alternatives. The lieutenant stripped unnecessary equipment and attached rope harness that would support his weight during crossing, and that would trail additional rope for bridge construction. The crossing rope was anchored to rock formation, using every carabiner and piton the column possessed, was tensioned as tightly as human strength could achieve, was tested with weights that suggested it might hold, but which couldn't definitively prove the rope would survive the actual crossing attempt. Midnight arrived, and the lieutenant began crossing with moonlight providing barely adequate visibility. Fergusson watched through binoculars as the lieutenant pulled himself along the rope, moving meter by meter across the chasm with deliberate control that came from understanding that mistakes would be fatal. The lieutenant was maybe 30 meters out when the rope began stretching under his weight in ways that suggested it might fail before he reached the far side. The stretch was increasing the crossing distance and was making the angle progressively worse as the lieutenant descended toward the lowest point where rope tension would be maximum and where failure was most likely, 50 meters, and the lieutenant was struggling visibly, his movements slower and less controlled as exhaustion accumulated and as the rope angle forced him to pull upward against his own weight. Fergusson couldn't communicate with him except through shouted instructions that probably couldn't be heard over the distance and the wind that was blowing up through the gorge. The crossing had become purely physical challenge, where the lieutenant either had sufficient strength to complete the traverse or he didn't, where technique and courage were meaningless compared to simple muscular endurance that was depleting with every meter. 70 meters, and the lieutenant stopped moving, hanging motionless on the rope for a period that seemed impossibly long. Fergusson assumed he was resting or adjusting his grip, or possibly that he had suffered some kind of injury that made continuing impossible. The possibility of failure became suddenly real. If the lieutenant couldn't complete the crossing, the bridge plan would collapse, and the column would be trapped with no alternatives except the unacceptable ones that the bridge was supposed to avoid. Fergusson felt the weight of command decisions that affected men's survival, felt the burden of having authorized attempt that might kill the lieutenant while accomplishing nothing. The lieutenant resumed movement and reached the 90-meter point where the rope angle began improving as he climbed toward the far cliff. The improvement was marginal, but it made movement easier, and his pace increased slightly as he approached the far side. At 120 meters, he reached rock face and began pulling himself up using handholds, began the final ascent that would either succeed or fail, based on whether the rock provided adequate holds and whether his remaining strength was sufficient for the climb. He disappeared over the edge, and Fergusson waited in darkness for signal that would indicate successful crossing. Minutes passed without sign, and Fergusson began calculating alternative plans that assumed the lieutenant had fallen or had been unable to find anchor points on the far side. Then torchlight flashed 3 times, the signal that meant crossing was successful and anchor points were adequate. The relief was overwhelming but temporary, because successful first crossing only meant the actual bridge construction could begin, only meant the impossible part was now possible rather than certain. The lieutenant secured the rope he had carried across and began pulling additional rope that other soldiers were feeding across the gorge. The process was agonizingly slow because friction and rope weight made hauling difficult, even with mechanical advantage created through improvised pulley systems. Each meter of rope that crossed took time that Fergusson didn't have, consumed darkness hours that were protection against Japanese observation. Dawn would bring visibility that would make the column's position obvious to any patrol within several kilometers, would make continued construction impossible without accepting combat that the column couldn't win given their tactical situation. 2 hours consumed in crossing sufficient rope to begin bridge construction. 2 hours that reduced remaining darkness to 6 hours for completing bridge that needed to support 47 wounded men, plus the soldiers who would carry them. Fergusson ordered construction teams to begin working on both sides simultaneously, building approaches and securing anchor points and rigging support systems that would prevent catastrophic failure when loaded men began crossing. The construction required coordination between teams separated by 200 meters, with no communication except shouted instructions and torch signals, required parallel work proceeding without ability to verify compatibility until final connection proved whether the two sides had been constructed to compatible specifications. The bridge design was improvised adaptation of suspension bridge principles with modifications dictated by available materials and time constraints. Primary load would be carried by 2 parallel ropes spanning the gorge, with crosspieces creating walking surface and handrail ropes providing stability for crossers. The design was minimalist by necessity. Anything more elaborate would require materials and time that didn't exist. But minimalist meant reduced safety margins and increased vulnerability to failure modes that proper engineering would have eliminated. Fergusson was gambling that adequate was sufficient, that bridge didn't need to be safe by peacetime standards, but only needed to work well enough to get wounded across before Japanese discovered the column's position. 4 hours until dawn, and the bridge was approximately 60% complete. The primary ropes were secured and tensioned. The first crosspieces were in place. The approaches were constructed sufficiently that men could begin crossing if necessary. But 60% meant the bridge couldn't yet support wounded being carried, meant that if Japanese attacked now, the column would have to either fight or abandon wounded to save the men who could still walk. Fergusson pushed the construction teams harder while knowing that exhaustion was degrading their precision and increasing probability of mistakes that could make the entire bridge unusable. Japanese patrol sounds came from the jungle behind the column's position, voices and equipment noise that suggested platoon-strength unit moving through area on search pattern. The Japanese were maybe 2 kilometers away based on sound, maybe 30 minutes from discovering the British position if their search was systematic. Fergusson ordered defensive positions established to delay any contact while keeping majority of soldiers focused on bridge completion that was suddenly becoming race between construction and discovery. The patrol sounds grew closer and more distinct, Japanese commands and metallic noises that suggested preparation for contact. Fergusson designated 20 men as rear guard and ordered everyone else to focus exclusively on bridge completion. The 20 men established positions covering the approaches to the bridge site, positioned themselves to provide maximum delay if Japanese discovered the column before bridge was completed. They were insufficient force for serious defense, but they might buy 15 or 20 minutes that could be difference between successful evacuation and catastrophic combat against superior numbers in tactically disadvantageous position. 5 hours into construction, and the bridge was maybe 80% complete, structurally sound enough that men could begin crossing, but not yet ready for wounded transport that required additional reinforcement and safety features. Fergusson made decision to begin moving walking wounded across immediately while construction continued on features needed for litter carriers. The walking wounded began crossing one at a time with agonizing slowness, each man taking several minutes to traverse the span while construction teams worked around them adding cross pieces and reinforcing anchor points. The Japanese patrol emerged from jungle 400 meters from the bridge site, visible in growing pre-dawn light as they moved through clearing. The patrol spotted the British rear guard and immediately deployed for attack, maneuvering to flank positions while maintaining fire discipline that suggested professional soldiers executing practiced procedures. Fergusson ordered the rear guard to delay without becoming decisively engaged, ordered them to fall back toward the bridge while maintaining contact that would prevent Japanese from maneuvering freely. The firefight began with Japanese probing attacks, testing British positions, trying to determine force size and tactical situation. The British rear guard responded with limited fire that suggested larger force than actually existed, tried to create impression that they were defending significant position rather than buying time for evacuation. The deception worked briefly. Japanese paused to assess the situation and to coordinate assault that they assumed would be necessary against what appeared to be substantial British defensive position. The pause bought 10 minutes that allowed 6 more wounded to cross the bridge and allowed construction teams to complete reinforcements necessary for litter transport. Fergusson ordered the seriously wounded to begin crossing carried by teams of 4 men per litter, ordered the crossing to proceed as rapidly as possible while maintaining enough control to prevent accident that would block the bridge and trap everyone still on the near side. The litter crossings were terrifyingly slow. Each casualty required 5 minutes to cross, with carriers moving carefully to avoid jarring injured men or losing balance on improvised bridge that swayed and flexed under their weight. Japanese assault began in earnest as their commander realized the British force was smaller than initially assessed, realized the delay had been deception rather than preparation for serious defense. The assault was aggressive and well-coordinated, began overrunning British positions through flanking maneuvers that the small rear guard couldn't effectively counter. Fergusson ordered the rear guard to withdraw to the bridge while maintaining suppressive fire, ordered fighting withdrawal that would bring soldiers back to crossing point while preventing Japanese from advancing so rapidly that they could engage men on the bridge. The withdrawal was disciplined chaos, where soldiers moved backward under fire while trying to maintain formation that would allow them to continue fighting effectively. 3 men were hit during the withdrawal, 2 with minor wounds that didn't prevent them from continuing movement, 1 with serious injury that required immediate evacuation. The seriously wounded man was dragged to the bridge and placed on litter that was next in crossing sequence, was carried across while Japanese fire was intensifying, and while the remaining rearguard was running out of positions they could defend. Dawn arrived with 12 wounded still on the near side, and Japanese forces maybe 100 meters from the bridge site. Fergusson ordered everyone who could walk to cross immediately, regardless of injury severity, ordered litter teams to work faster despite risks involved. The bridge became crowded with multiple men crossing simultaneously, became overloaded beyond what the construction had been designed to handle. The ropes stretched under the additional weight, and cross pieces began shifting in ways that suggested imminent structural failure. Fergusson was last across carrying wounded soldier on his back, while Japanese fire was hitting rock around the bridge anchorage. He reached the far side as his engineers were preparing to cut the bridge ropes to prevent Japanese from using the span to cross. The ropes were cut, and the bridge collapsed into the gorge, eliminating the crossing point and leaving Japanese stranded on the far side without ability to pursue effectively. The column had escaped with all wounded and with minimal additional casualties, despite tactical situation that should have forced either abandonment or catastrophic combat. The Japanese didn't attempt to cross the gorge immediately. They lacked equipment for building replacement bridge, and the gorge was too wide for any improvised crossing they could construct quickly. By the time Japanese engineers could build proper bridge, Fergusson's column would be kilometers away, moving toward Allied positions, with wounded who now had chance of survival instead of certainty of death or capture. The rope bridge had bought time and distance that transformed tactical disaster into survivable situation. The 8-hour construction period had saved 47 wounded men who would have died if the column had been forced to fight or abandon them. The bridge had worked despite seeming impossible during planning, had held together through crossings that exceeded its design limitations, had been completed despite Japanese interference, and despite darkness, and despite exhaustion, that made precision work nearly impossible. The success validated Fergusson's decision to attempt the impossible rather than accept the unacceptable, validated the engineering improvisation that had created functional bridge from inadequate materials and inadequate time. The column reached Allied positions 3 days later, with all wounded surviving the additional march. The wounded were evacuated to field hospitals where medical care that had been impossible in jungle could be provided. 21 of the 47 survived their injuries, survival rate that was remarkable given severity of wounds and length of time that had elapsed between injury and definitive treatment. The other 26 died from complications or infections that earlier evacuation might have prevented, died despite the bridge and despite the escape, died because jungle warfare made casualties extraordinarily difficult to save even when tactical situations allowed evacuation. Fergusson wrote detailed report about the bridge construction that was filed with Chindit Command as example of improvised engineering under combat conditions. The report included specifications for rope bridge construction, described materials required and construction procedures, analyzed what had worked and what could be improved if similar situations occurred in future operations. The report was a practical document focused on enabling others to replicate the success rather than on claiming personal recognition for the innovation. The report became reference material for special operations units training for jungle warfare, became example taught in military engineering courses as case study of improvisation under extreme constraints. The bridge construction was analyzed not because it was particularly elegant engineering, but because it had solved immediate problem using available resources within impossible time constraints. The analysis emphasized adaptation rather than standard procedures, emphasized understanding principles well enough to improvise solutions when circumstances made standard approaches ineffective. The lieutenant who had made the first crossing received military cross for actions that had enabled the bridge construction and the column's escape. The citation described his crossing as demonstrating exceptional courage and skill under conditions that made failure likely, and where failure would have had catastrophic consequences for the entire column. The lieutenant accepted the recognition, but felt uncomfortable with individual recognition for what had been collective effort involving dozens of soldiers working together under desperate circumstances. Fergusson himself received Distinguished Service Order for leadership throughout the operation, including but not limited to the bridge construction. The citation noted his tactical decisions and his ability to improvise solutions to problems that conventional doctrine didn't address. The recognition was welcome, but Fergusson remained focused on the 26 wounded who had died despite his efforts, remained aware that success was partial and that better decisions or better luck might have saved more lives. The rope and equipment used for bridge construction was lost when the bridge was cut, was dropped into the gorge to prevent Japanese from salvaging materials that might have intelligence value. The loss was operationally insignificant. The rope had served its purpose and couldn't be carried on subsequent marches, but it meant physical evidence of the bridge disappeared completely within hours of its construction. The bridge existed only in memory and in reports and in photographs that someone had taken during construction, but which showed details that military classification would keep hidden for decades after the war concluded. Post-war analysis of Chindit operations identified the bridge construction as one of several improvised solutions that had characterized the campaign, that had demonstrated how special operations required different approaches than conventional military operations. The Chindits had succeeded partially because they had been willing to attempt solutions that conventional wisdom considered impossible, had been willing to accept risks that regular forces would have rejected as unacceptable. The bridge was example of that mindset translated into practical engineering challenge, where standard assessment would have concluded crossing was impossible and therefore shouldn't be attempted. The gorge remains as geographic feature in Burma where the crossing occurred, remains obstacle that would prevent movement by any unit without engineering support. The rock formations that served as anchor points still exist, bearing no marks that indicate their use for bridge construction, bearing no memorial acknowledging that British soldiers had crossed here under conditions that made crossing seem impossible. The location is remote and rarely visited and unmarked, except on military maps that show terrain features without historical context. Fergusson continued commanding Chindit operations through remainder of Burma campaign, participated in several additional operations that demonstrated similar improvisation under difficult conditions. He survived the war and wrote extensively about Chindit operations, documenting the tactical innovations and the human costs and the lessons that should inform future special operations. His writings emphasized practical problem-solving rather than dramatic heroics, emphasized that special operations succeeded through preparation and adaptability rather than through extraordinary courage alone. The bridge construction represented a moment where engineering challenge became survival necessity, where theoretical knowledge about rope bridges had to be translated into functional structure under combat pressure with inadequate materials and insufficient time. The translation succeeded because multiple people contributed expertise and labor and creativity, because the column included individuals who understood climbing and rope work and improvised construction. The success wasn't attributable to any single decision or any individual contribution, but emerged from collective effort, where everyone focused on shared problem that required solving, regardless of whether solution seemed achievable. Modern military engineering includes training scenarios based on Fergusson's bridge construction, includes exercises where soldiers must build rope bridges under time pressure using limited materials. The exercises teach principles rather than specific procedures, teach that engineering problems have multiple potential solutions if you understand underlying physics and materials science. Fergusson's bridge is studied not because it was optimal solution, but because it was sufficient solution created under conditions where optimal wasn't achievable, and where sufficient was enough to accomplish the mission. The 47 wounded men who crossed the bridge returned to various outcomes after medical treatment. Some returned to combat duty, some were invalided out of service with permanent disabilities. Some died from complications months after the initial evacuation. Their survival long enough to receive medical care was directly attributable to bridge that had allowed evacuation when tactical situation suggested abandonment was only realistic option. The bridge's value was measured in those lives preserved through improvised construction that had seemed impossible during planning, but which had worked when execution began. The psychological impact of the bridge construction extended beyond the immediate tactical success. The soldiers who had participated in building and crossing the bridge developed confidence in their ability to solve problems that appeared impossible when initially encountered, developed understanding that standard solutions weren't the only options available when circumstances demanded alternatives. The psychological effect mattered because Chindit operations consistently placed soldiers in situations where conventional approaches didn't work and where improvisation was survival requirement rather than occasional necessity. Fergusson recognized the psychological dimension and emphasized it in training for subsequent operations. He taught that apparent impossibility was often just difficulty combined with unfamiliarity, that problems which seemed unsolvable usually had solutions if you could identify correct approach and commit necessary resources. The bridge had been proving case for that philosophy. The crossing had seemed impossible until the lieutenant demonstrated it was merely extremely difficult. The construction had seemed unfeasible until teams demonstrated it was achievable with sustained effort. The lesson was applicable beyond bridge building to broader tactical situations, where first assessment suggested problems were unsolvable when they were actually just challenging. The material science knowledge required for bridge construction hadn't been standard military training, but had been drawn from civilian expertise that various column members possessed. The lieutenant's climbing background had been crucial, but so had contributions from soldiers who understood carpentry, or rope work, or improvised construction from their civilian occupations. The diversity of background knowledge had created collective capability that no individual possessed, had demonstrated that military effectiveness benefited from recruiting soldiers with varied skills rather than seeking homogeneous capabilities. British military doctrine after the war incorporated lessons about utilizing civilian expertise within military context, incorporated understanding that specialized knowledge from non-military backgrounds could provide tactical advantages in situations conventional training didn't address. Ferguson's bridge became example cited in training materials about how diverse unit composition could enable solutions to problems that homogeneous units couldn't solve effectively. The example wasn't about bridge building specifically, but about broader principle that varied expertise created resilience when circumstances made standard approaches ineffective. The crossing technique the lieutenant had used, pulling himself hand over hand along horizontal rope, was physically demanding beyond what normal training prepared soldiers for. The lieutenant had maintained climbing fitness through his own initiative during months when operational tempo made dedicated training impossible, had preserved capability that conventional assessment might have considered irrelevant to jungle warfare. His fitness for tasks that seemed tangential to Chindit mission requirements had proven operationally decisive when circumstances created need for exactly the capability he had maintained. The example demonstrated value of maintaining diverse capabilities even when immediate mission requirements didn't obviously demand them. The Japanese force that had pursued Ferguson's column eventually crossed the gorge 3 days after the bridge had been cut, after their engineers constructed proper span using equipment and materials that Ferguson's column hadn't possessed. The Japanese crossing took 36 hours with professional engineering support and daylight working conditions, which contextualizes how remarkable it was that British force had built functional bridge in 8 hours during darkness with improvised materials. The Japanese never learned details about British bridge construction because physical evidence had been destroyed when ropes were cut, because there was nothing remaining at the site that would indicate how the crossing had been accomplished. Japanese after-action reports noted British unit had escaped across terrain that should have trapped them, noted this suggested British possessed mobility capabilities that Japanese planning hadn't accounted for. The reports recommended increased surveillance of terrain features that might enable British movement through areas that Japanese considered impassable. The recommendations were tactically sound, but operationally impractical. Surveillance of every potential crossing point would have required resources that Japanese didn't have available in Burma theater, would have dispersed forces in ways that made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of Chindit operations that Ferguson's column had been conducting. The rope that had been used for bridge construction became small controversy within British Logistics Command after the operation concluded. The rope had been drawn from supplies intended for other purposes, had been requisitioned without proper authorization through channels that Fergusson had bypassed because administrative procedures were too slow for operational timeline. The unauthorized requisition violated supply procedures, but had been necessary for mission success, created tension between administrative requirements and tactical realities that characterized much of special operations logistics throughout the war. Fergusson defended his supply procedures by noting that administrative compliance would have prevented bridge construction and would have resulted in casualties that proper procedures weren't designed to cause. The defense was pragmatic rather than procedural, but it was effective because results validated the approach. The wounded had survived, and the mission had succeeded, and the administrative irregularities seemed minor compared to those operational accomplishments. The incident became case study in logistics training about balancing procedural compliance against mission requirements, about when rules should be followed and when they should be adapted to circumstances that their authors hadn't anticipated. The construction timeline, 8 hours from decision to completion, became benchmark for evaluating improvised engineering capabilities. 8 hours suggested that motivated soldiers with basic materials could accomplish substantial engineering projects if they understood principles and if they maintained focus despite exhaustion and pressure. The timeline wasn't replicable as standard because circumstances had been unique, and because the bridge had been built with acceptable risk levels that peacetime engineering wouldn't consider acceptable. But as benchmark for what was possible under extreme conditions, the 8 hours demonstrated human capability to perform beyond normal expectations when necessity demanded extraordinary effort. The wounded who had survived because of the bridge mostly never learned the details about how the crossing had been accomplished. They had been unconscious or semi-conscious during the evacuation, had experienced the crossing as fragmentary memories that didn't include understanding of the engineering effort that had enabled their survival. Some learned about the bridge later through Fergusson's reports or through conversations with soldiers who had participated in construction. But many simply knew they had been evacuated across gorge without understanding how the evacuation had been physically possible. The disconnect between experience and understanding was characteristic of warfare, where individuals experienced events without comprehending broader context that made those events possible. The wounded had survived because of bridge, but their survival didn't require them knowing about rope tensions and anchor points and construction procedures that had been necessary for crossing. Their survival was outcome that mattered regardless of whether they understood the causation, was result that justified the effort, even though many beneficiaries never fully comprehended what had been done to preserve their lives. Fergusson's report about the bridge construction circulated among British Special Operations units and eventually reached American and Commonwealth forces, training for similar operations. The report influenced how those forces approached improvised engineering challenges, influenced their understanding of what was achievable with limited materials and compressed timelines. The influence was subtle. Units didn't adopt specific bridge-building procedures, but adopted mindset that improvisation was viable response to situations where standard procedures were inadequate. The mindset shift was more valuable than specific technical knowledge because mindset applied across diverse situations, while technical knowledge was useful only in circumstances that closely matched original context. The gorge crossing became one of several celebrated Chindit operations that demonstrated special operations capabilities but also demonstrated special operations costs. The Chindits had succeeded in disrupting Japanese operations and gathering intelligence, but had suffered casualty rates that made sustained operations unsustainable. Fergusson's column had been relatively fortunate. They had suffered fewer casualties than some other columns and had achieved more complete mission objectives. But even their success had come with human costs that made continuation questionable. Post-war assessment of Chindit operations remained contentious, with supporters arguing the operations had tied down Japanese forces and disrupted their logistics, while critics argued the results hadn't justified the casualties and resources consumed. The bridge construction wasn't central to those debates. It was tactical success within larger strategic campaign whose value remained disputed, but it represented the kind of improvisation that had characterized Chindit operations and that had made both their successes and their controversies possible. Fergusson became historian of Chindit operations after the war, documenting the campaign with attention to both achievements and failures. His historical work acknowledged that bridge construction had been necessary given circumstances, but also acknowledged that better operational planning might have prevented the circumstances that had made desperate bridge building necessary. The self-critical analysis was unusual for military memoirs, but it reflected Fergusson's belief that honest assessment was more valuable than self-congratulation, that understanding failures was as important as celebrating successes. The bridge location remained unmarked in Burma for decades after the war, remained known only to participants who remembered coordinates from maps and to researchers who studied operational reports. In 1980s, British Veterans Organization attempted to place memorial marker at the site, but discovered the location was inaccessible without substantial expedition that neither veterans nor government were willing to fund. The memorial plan was abandoned, and the gorge remained unmarked, known to history through documents rather than through physical commemoration. The absence of physical memorial wasn't unusual for remote locations where wartime events had occurred without leaving lasting traces. Many significant tactical events happened in locations that returned to undisturbed wilderness after military forces departed, happened in places that had been strategically important temporarily, but which had no long-term significance that would justify memorialization. The bridge site was one of thousands of such locations where history had occurred without leaving marks that subsequent generations could visit or acknowledge physically. The rope bridge technique that Fergusson's column had used was refined and formalized in post-war special operations training, was transformed from improvised solution to documented procedure that could be taught systematically. The formalization required testing to establish safety parameters and load limits and construction procedures that could be replicated reliably. The testing revealed that Fergusson's original bridge had been operating beyond what formal safety analysis would have permitted, had been functioning with margins so thin that failure could have occurred at any moment during the crossing operations. The revelation that the bridge had been more dangerous than participants realized during construction created mixed reactions among survivors. Some felt retrospective anxiety about risks they had unknowingly accepted, felt disturbed by learning how close they had come to catastrophic failure. Others felt validated that their assessment of the bridge as barely adequate had been accurate, felt their caution during crossing had been justified by engineering analysis that confirmed their intuitive concerns. The emotional responses varied, but they shared recognition that desperation had made acceptable what calculation would have rejected, that survival necessity had overridden safety considerations, that peacetime engineering considered inviolable. Modern rope bridge construction training includes Fergusson's bridge as historical example, but emphasizes that contemporary standards wouldn't permit similar construction under similar conditions. The training uses the historical case to illustrate principles, but also to demonstrate how much engineering safety standards have evolved since World War II, how much more risk wartime operations accepted compared to contemporary military practices. The comparison serves multiple pedagogical purposes. It honors historical innovation while also emphasizing why current procedures differ from historical approaches, why lessons from the past must be adapted rather than blindly replicated. The lieutenant who made first crossing across the gorge continued military service through the war's conclusion and received additional decorations for subsequent operations. He survived the war and emigrated to New Zealand, where he became climbing instructor and mountain guide. His military service remained an important part of his identity, but he preferred discussing climbing techniques and mountain safety rather than wartime operations. The war had been necessary, but difficult experience while climbing was chosen activity that brought joy rather than trauma. He gave interview in 1970s, where he discussed the gorge crossing with more candor than military reports had permitted. He acknowledged that he had been terrified during the crossing, that reaching the halfway point he had seriously doubted he would complete the traverse, that only knowledge that wounded men's survival depended on his success had motivated him to continue when his muscles were failing and his grip was weakening. The honesty about fear and doubt made the achievement more impressive rather than less. He had succeeded despite terror rather than through absence of fear, had continued despite doubt rather than through naive confidence. The interview became valuable historical document because it captured subjective experience that operational reports hadn't recorded, captured emotional and physical reality that formal documentation typically omitted. Military history benefited from access to both official records and personal testimony because official records documented what happened while personal testimony explained how it felt, because complete understanding required both objective facts and subjective experiences that shaped those facts. Ferguson's leadership during the bridge construction emergency was analyzed in military leadership courses as example of decision-making under uncertainty. The analysis focused on how Fergusson had made commitment to bridge construction despite incomplete information, how he had allocated resources to attempt solution whose success probability couldn't be calculated accurately, how he had maintained focus on mission objectives while adapting tactics to circumstances that planning hadn't anticipated. The case study was useful because leadership often required decisions without complete information, required commitment despite uncertainty, required adaptation when circumstances made original plans unworkable. The bridge had lasted only hours before being deliberately destroyed, but its effects persisted through lives that were saved and through tactical flexibility that was preserved. The wounded who survived contributed to subsequent operations or returned to civilian life or influenced people through relationships that continued because the bridge had enabled their evacuation. The tactical flexibility meant Ferguson's column remained an effective unit that could continue operations rather than becoming combat ineffective due to casualties. The effects rippled through time in ways that couldn't be traced precisely, but which demonstrated that single tactical success could have consequences extending far beyond immediate circumstances. The engineering principles that made the bridge possible, load distribution, anchor strength, rope tension dynamics, were known to military engineers in 1944, but weren't typically applied under field conditions that made precise calculation impossible. Ferguson's construction had applied those principles through estimation and improvisation, rather than through formal engineering analysis, had demonstrated that principles could guide practical work even when circumstances prevented rigorous calculation. The demonstration validated educational approaches emphasizing principles over procedures, understanding over memorization, adaptation over rigid adherence to doctrine.